Welcome to On Exhibit. This show is really going to be special today because, as you can already tell, I have visitors from the North Pole. I am so glad that it's cool today because I would hate for it to be really hot when they came down for their visit. As you can see, I have Santa, or Saint Nick, or Father Christmas, whatever name you want to give him. He's with me today. But he has brought along with him Bucky. And if you look very carefully at Bucky's face, you will see that the markings on his nose looks like a Christmas tree. Now, Bucky is really Mrs. Claus's cat. And so, Santa, will you tell us how Bucky became a member of Mrs. Claus's family?
Well, I tell you, it's kind of an unusual story. To begin with, Bucky is what's called a Christmas Himalayan cat. It's a very special breed, and there aren't very many of them in the whole world. And they come from Tibet. A little boy in Kathmandu, Tibet, sent this cat to Mrs. Claus. The reason why he sent it was that he was from a very poor family, and his mom told him if the mama cat had kittens, he'd have to get rid of them. Well, time went on, and his mama cat did have some kittens. And so the little boy knew he had to get rid of them. And he thought, where could I give a cat to somebody that lives where it's cold and snowy all the time, and somebody that would love animals? Well, we had just lost Gulliver, our big old St. Bernard that we used to carry hot chocolate out to the elves that got lost in snowdrifts. And somehow this little boy knew about that. So he put Bucky in a little crate and wrapped it up good and tight and addressed it to Mrs. Claus. Well, he sent it by UPS, and the plane came to North Pole City, near where we live, and the UPS elf delivered it. Now at the North Pole, they don't have those brown trucks, you know. At the North Pole, they drive brown snowmobiles. And I was sitting in my office one day, and sit down, Buck. And I heard this, and it got louder and louder, and finally it stopped right outside my window. And I looked out, and there was the UPS elf with this crate. And Snowflake, my chief elf, she ran and opened the door and signed for the package and brought it into my office and said, Santa, what do you want to do with this? And I said, well, I'm awful busy right now. And she said, well, it's addressed to Mrs. Claus. And I said, well, why don't you take it into Mrs. Claus? And so she left and she went into Mrs. Claus in the kitchen. Now at the North Pole, we don't go outside. We go from one building to the next. We have snow tunnels. Well, anyway, when she came back, about that time the phone rang. Ring, and I answered it. Claus here. That's the way I answer the phone, you know. And it was Mrs. Claus on the other end, and she says, Santa, come quick. And she hung up. Well, I jumped out of my chair and went running as fast as I could through the snow tunnel. And right behind me on those short little legs of hers came Snowflake the elf. Well, we got to the kitchen about the same time, and I yanked the door open, and Snowflake zipped past me, and we got in there, and Mrs. Claus was sitting at the kitchen table, and she was crying. And I said, what's wrong, Dumpling? I call her Dumpling, you know. And she said, Snowflake, here, read this. And it was a letter from this little boy in Kathmandu, to bed. Well, basically what it said was that his mama cat had had kittens and he couldn't keep them, and he thought and thought about who lives where it's cold and snowy all the time, and he thought of Mrs. Claus, and that's why he sent it to us. So that's how Bucky came to live at our house. Now there's a couple of other funny things that Bucky does. He'll sit at the window and watch the snow come down. He'll sit on the windowsill, and the snow, he'll just watch like this as each flake comes down. And when it's really snowing hard and the wind is blowing, he's trying to watch it, but he doesn't know where to look because there's so many snowflakes.
And they're moving so fast.
Yes. But the other thing that he does is kind of funny. We have a kind of a big operation out there in the North Pole. I think Buck wants to get down. Okay, I'm going to put him down, and he can go visit. But anyway, he likes to ride on the conveyor belt that we move the toys around on, and that's kind of interesting. So anyway, that's the story of Buckwheat the cat.
Well, he certainly seems to be curious.
Oh, he's like all cats. He's very curious.
Well, so tell me, does he take the hot chocolate down to the elves?
No, he doesn't. We actually have the hot chocolate piped out to the toy shop, and we're able to handle it that way. That way they have plenty of hot chocolate, and everything turns out just fine.
Well, I know that you probably have loads of stories, but I also know that when you come to town, that you are just bombarded with all sorts of questions. And the main one is, who teaches the reindeer to fly?
Well, you know, I get that question asked an awful lot. And that's kind of an interesting story in that at the North Pole, reindeer don't live there. And that surprises a lot of people. Yeah. Polar bears are about the only animals we have. Now, polar bears have big, round feet, and they don't sink down in the snow. Now, a reindeer with small hoofs, they would sink, and they'd go out of sight, and if we didn't know they had disappeared, they'd freeze, and so we don't want that. So I have to import those reindeer from the northern part of Norway, Sweden, and there's a place up there called Lapland. Now, it's not a country, it's just a section of the country. And every Christmas, when I'm on my way back from delivering all the toys to the boys and girls, we stop in Lapland, and it's just beginning to get daylight outside. And we visit a guy named Lars Svensson, and he's got one of the largest reindeer herds there is. Now, up there, the wind blows so hard all the time, there really isn't anything but ice. And so the reindeer can run across that and won't sink in. We visit with Lars, have a cup of hot chocolate until it gets daylight, and then we go out and pick out 3 or 4 elves. 3 or 4 elves, 3 or 4 reindeer. And Ike the elf that trains them always tells me how many to bring back. So the elves that ride on the sleigh with me, they'll load them in the sleigh, and we always fasten their seatbelt. And then we move right on to taking off and going to the North Pole. And about 5 minutes before we get there, I call a guy named Ike, the elf, on the cell phone, and he is still asleep. And it wakes him up. He pulls on his boots, and he runs through the tunnel out to the barn where the reindeer live. And he peeks through a little crack there, and when he sees us coming, he rolls that big old heavy door back, and we just fly right in. Well, now the training starts about here. First, we have to take care of Dancer, Prancer, Vixen, Comet, Cupid, all those guys. We wipe them down and get them dried off and put them in their personal stalls. And then we unhitch, take the seat belt off of the new reindeer. And then, guess what? Ike will get in front of them. He'll say, "Okay, you guys, today you're going to learn how to fly." And, you know, he talks just about. Now, Ike's about that tall. And I have to tell you, he doesn't eat his vegetables. And he doesn't drink his milk or his juice. And he's 62 and his teeth are starting to fall out. So I hope the boys and girls will remember to drink their milk and their juice and always eat their vegetables because they're really good for you. Well, anyway, the other thing you need to understand is at the North Pole, our zero gravity is about here. You know, now if you've ever watched the astronauts in a space shuttle or what have you, you'll see them floating around. Well, they're in zero gravity, aren't they? Well, same thing happens at the North Pole, but it's only about that far off the ground. Well, Ike tells them he wants them to get warmed up, and he tells them to run back and forth in the barn, and it's a big barn. He tells them to run 10 times, and they do. And when they get back after running 10 laps, he says, "Okay, now you guys, I want you to run and jump. Run and jump," like that. Well, they start running, they kind of do little hops. He says, "What are you guys, a bunch of bunny rabbits? I want you to jump." And boy, they start jumping higher. Well, before you know it, one of them will jump up into zero gravity, and he starts floating up there. And he'll say, "Hey, look at me. I'm flying, I'm flying." And all of the other reindeer stop and they look, and they are really amazed. And so they start running and jumping, and before you know it, they're all flying. And you know, if you really want to do something, and you try and try, and eventually you learn how to do it, it becomes easier every time. So that's the way the reindeer learn to fly.
Well, Santa, we're going to take a little break right now, but you just stay put, because when we come back, Santa's going to tell us some more stories, and we're going to talk about some Christmas traditions, maybe traditions at the North Pole, traditions of right here in Arlington.